Now. Welcome to this Legal Aid New South Wales webinar, Let's Talk About Consent. My name is Bridget Barker and I work in the Community Legal Education branch at Legal Aid New South Wales. And we also have Julianne who will be presenting your webinar today. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, Bridget.
Before we begin the webinar properly, I just would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the owners and custodians, on whose land we are broadcasting from today. I am broadcasting from the land of the Widjabul people of the Bundjalung Nation. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today or viewing the recording. Okay, that's it from me. I'll now hand over to Julianne. Thanks, Julianne.
Thanks so much, Bridget. And just to follow on from that, I'm coming to you today from Gadigal land, and it is my pleasure to be able to do that. I'd also just like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in our remote audience today. Thanks for joining us from far and wide. We're going to be talking today about consent, obviously, and what I would like to say, because it can be a little bit of a tricky topic for people to discuss, I always, when I do this workshop in schools or with youth services or with community workers, I want to remind people that we are not aiming to make anyone feel unsafe. If there is something that comes up for you during this workshop, please do feel completely comfortable to just, sign out again. We're not going to take offence at that. The most important thing is that you're okay. And if need be, you can contact us for some relevant support services later on, or even in the question box while we go along. Thank you for bearing with me when we do this workshop. I do get a little bit nervous about talking on webinars, even though I talk all the time for a living. It's just very strange. We'll move on to the next slide, but also I'm going to say, we're talking today about consent, but I wanted to just kind of broaden it out a little bit for community workers. In case you do work with young people, that's my specialty area. I'm doing workshops with young people, so hopefully this information will also be useful to you as well. So before we even start on the topic of consent, what I wanted to say is that there are various ways that young people who are involved in the criminal justice system can get help, and those ways are on the screen there. But if you have any clients who've been charged with a crime in New South Wales, they can get free representation at court. If you have a young person who's concerned about fines, criminal law at the police station, they can call us on the Legal Aid Youth Hotline. And we do visit young people in juvie as well. And obviously also what we're doing today, which is education. And part of that education is, of course, making sure that young people are safe and can make decisions that keep themselves safe and out of trouble too. Thanks, Bridget. Okay. So what are we going to talk about today? Obviously consent. We're going to talk about the new consent laws. We're going to talk a little bit about what an ethical approach to consent might look like, especially around education. We will look at the topics that, sorry, can we just go back to that? Yep, great. We're going to look at the topics, we're going to look at the laws that can be in play if there is no consent, because obviously that's one aspect of this work as well. And we're going to finish up with a quiz at the end to see how many of you are listening. Sometimes what I'll get audiences to do is to kind of think about what we mean by consent generally. I think we've probably got too many people in this audience to do that today, but I wanted to share with you a little bit of a story that often comes up with the young people that I work with, and that's the idea of, well, why don't we just deal with consent as if it was a contract? And that's a strange concept, really, because, to me, I can't think of much less sexy than thinking about contracts in that situation. But we kind of work through it and we see what the issues are with that. And we realize very quickly that a kind of a typical idea of what a contract is does not work with consent. You write something down on a bit of paper, you both sign it, you hop into bed, and all of a sudden, you might want to change it because you want to do more, or you decide you want to do less. And young people will very quickly realize that just because you signed a contract doesn't mean that you can make somebody do something that they signed a contract about just a few minutes ago. So I think, having these conversations with young people, it can be a very creative process. And when you lead them through some of those ideas, they can actually come up with some really brilliant solutions and thoughts for themselves, which is great. And that leads on, obviously, to some of the topics that we're going to talk about today. All right. Okay, this is probably the slide that you're all here for today. We have had a big change in the law in New South Wales. And to give a little bit of a background for those people who might not have been following as nerdily as possibly I have been, the changes to the law came out of a Four Corners episode, which had a look at a particular case involving Saxon Mullins and a dude called Lazarus. And the result of that legal case was quite controversial at the time. And also once the Four Corners episode came out, the law around consent was actually sent off to the Law Reform Commission of New South Wales to see if we could, or to see if they could suggest some improvements to how the laws around consent were written. And the big thing that they came back with is that we should be looking at something called an affirmative consent model. And the affirmative consent model is something that's been around in some of the other states for a while, for example, Tasmania. And it basically changed the dynamic somewhat from so I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think of the best way to do it simply. So affirmative consent is basically, as I've written up on the slide, is that you can't assume. If you're not sure if somebody is consenting to sex, you have to check. Now, the checking in might be to do with actually looking for somebody to say yes, I'm all good. It might also be body language, but it's no longer going to be a thing that somebody can say, well, I didn't know they weren't consenting. If you don't know whether someone's consenting, the onus then is on you to check. Okay. Is this a flash? Bridget, there's something, oh no, okay, sorry, there was something flashing on the screen, but I'm not sure what that is. Okay, so if we step back a bit though, we also want to have a look at what are some of the overriding principles around consent, because one of the really important things is that consent means somebody's right to choose, okay? And the new consent legislation is meant to really reinforce that. We all have the right to choose whether or not we want to, kiss, touch, have sexual activity with someone. And that's a foundational issue in the consent laws. We have already said we need to check in. Now, in some ways, if any of you do this work with young people, you might already have been suggesting that checking in and communication are really important parts of having sex with someone, or having any kind of sexual activity with someone. So in some ways, it's not going to feel like this kind of really weird thing to work with your clients using the new definition. Obviously, that can be extended, not just, when you start sex, but also just because you've consented to one thing doesn't mean you've consented to everything along the way. Checking in every time you change something up. And of course, we know that consent can be withdrawn at any time. So just because we start something, there's no obligation on either person or any person in that situation to continue if they don't want to continue. And in that sense, really what we're going pretty hard on at the moment, I guess, is that communication is sexy, in that sense that checking in with people is going to make sure that everyone has a good time. So we've also got consent has to be free and voluntary. So of course there are going to be times when somebody is just not able to give consent. If they're heavily affected by drugs and alcohol, if they're unconscious or asleep, if they're being manipulated or threatened, or if they're under the age of 16. And we're going to come back to the age of consent a little bit later. Now, sometimes if I'm talking about the idea of people being asleep and not being able to give consent, young people kind of like laugh a lot, which is interesting because, of course, some of the matters that we see at court do involve somebody waking up in that situation, which is, not great. So we can't just assume that people are going to know about this already or potentially care. But it's important that we're kind of really explicit about all of these different things, even if it seems for somebody like common sense. I don't know if you've actually had a chance to watch the tea video, so comparing consent to a cup of tea. We show it a lot in my classes, and I know you might be thinking, oh, is that the milkshake one? No, it is not the milkshake video. If you had the misfortune of actually watching that one, it's very different. It's a little bit more to the point, and actually mentions the word sex, which is always useful, so that people are having a think about, the ridiculousness of not thinking about consent. And some of the issues that come up in that video are things that we might not necessarily think about all the time. Like, just because they said yes last night doesn't mean, when you wake up in the morning, they're going to say yes again. Or just because they said yes a couple of weeks ago doesn't mean you can turn up to their house and expect them to say yes again, because last time it was a thing. So I think it's a really great little video if you want to check it out. I wanted to just quickly go through some of the other situations where consent can never be given. And most importantly, it's the one where there's a position of power. So if there is a teacher, a youth worker, a community worker, a coach, something like that, even if a young person is a bit older, say 16 or 17, there can never be any consent in that situation because the power imbalance is not appropriate. They've got a position of authority over that young person. Okay, so just to recap, probably because this is, the most important big change, is that if we look at the new consent laws, I mean, there are a bunch of other things in there as well, but the most important thing for practical everyday stuff is that somebody has to do or say something to communicate their consent. If they haven't said anything, that doesn't mean that they consent. If they haven't said anything and you're not sure, you have to check in. Check in, check in, check in. Okay, and that is literally the law now. So you can't just let it go. You have to be sure. Okay, let's move along to the next slide, if that's okay. And here's Kermit wondering if ethics have anything to do with the way that we talk about consent law. And I wanted to talk about this with you all today because I think it's kind of like I suggested earlier, it's kind of a given in some ways that we have always encouraged clients or people that we work with to have really good communication when it comes to sex. This workshop is crime prevention in the sense that we're not just talking to young people about how the exact laws work, but also how to stay well away from those red lines that we don't want to cross. So hopefully what we have out in the world are young people and people generally. I just always fall back onto young people because that's my usual work. But what we're hoping is that young people aren't there going about their business just trying to avoid getting charged. And unfortunately, I guess consent often is discussed in relation to sexual assault directly. What we might want to be thinking about is how good discussions of consent are actually just an ethical discussion. So we would communicate with people not only because it means that we won't be breaking the law, but also because we care about the people that we're with and that we want to make sure that everyone kind of wakes up in the morning and is very comfortable about what happened the night before. There's no miscommunications, there's no misunderstandings. And so often what we see in our work is people that just like misreading signals or having a completely different story about how the night went from their partner. And that's because they just didn't take the time to communicate well, to listen, to be aware of when things change, when the vibe changes. A lot of people do feel like, oh, that is such a weird thing to actually talk during sex. That's not sexy. So what we're trying to encourage is the idea that communication is sexy, just like consent is sexy, and it's actually going to lead to everyone having a much better time of it. And obviously that goes well beyond sticking to the law. That means we learn the law, but we also realize that, you know, we're doing this because we want to be people who respect other people, if that makes sense. Okay. Let's move on to offences. All right, so this is kind of also part of the whole thing. Is like the reason why the consent laws are changed is because consent relates directly to a number of crimes on our books, and some of the more serious ones, of course, and some of the most damaging in a way. The first one we're going to look at is sexual assault. If we could just move that along. Thank you. Now, I have this conversation quite a lot because I've realized that out in the world, not, you know, everyone is going to be familiar with the legal language. So oftentimes I'll do a little quiz about saying, well, okay, so to you, what's the difference between a sexual assault and rape? And young people will be like, oh, rape is the sex and sexual assault is all of the other things. You know, like being touched when you don't want to be or something like that. And I'm like, okay, all right. So I have to go back and say, look, I really appreciate that you've been able to share that with me. But for us as lawyers, what we're going to be doing is using sexual assault in a different way, because that's what it is in the law books. Rape is actually not a thing that you'll find in any Crimes Act in New South Wales. So the crime itself of having sex with someone else without their consent is actually called sexual assault. And then there are other crimes that we'll discuss a little bit later that are connected but not the same. So this also came out of a really interesting workshop where one of the girls that were involved in the workshop was quite upset that I hadn't used the word rape, and she thought that that had been because I was trying to downplay the seriousness of rape, and I felt quite awful because I was like, oh my goodness, no, of course not. I'm a lawyer, and you know, we have to use the legal words and not the community words, you know. And so we had a good conversation and we sorted it all out. But ever since then, I've been like, okay, these are the differences. Clearly there are, and it's very consistent. Every school I go to, the kids will identify that same understanding of the difference between rape and sexual assault. So I think language in this sense is quite important, and clearing that up as well is super important. So obviously we've got sexual assault. So if somebody has sex with someone else without their consent, they're going to be looking at a maximum penalty of 14 years in jail and possibly ending up on the Child Protection Register. We'll talk about the Child Protection Register later. Just in terms of what actual sex means, because obviously it means different things to lots of different people, but for the law, in this situation, sex is sexual penetration that involves a body part such as a penis, finger or tongue, or object touching a vagina, anus or mouth, and it includes penetration to any degree. Okay, sorry about that explicitness, but I think you know, it's important to be explicit when we're talking about such serious things. Now, that is the penalty for a sexual assault, but we've also got a situation where if somebody has used violence or threatened violence, or if there are more people involved, it can become what's called an aggravated sexual assault, which then raises the maximum penalty to about 20 years. No questions, Bridget? Quiet.
Not yet, but just a comment about the T video being great, that there are two versions, one with swear words and one without.
And the British one is the best. Don't see if you can find the British version. It's much, I think it's much better than the US one. So no racism.
And someone else has just said the T video is so much better than the moving the goalpost video. But there is a question just come through, if you don't mind me asking that now.
Yeah, please. Yeah,
when you talk to young people about consent and refer to manipulation as something that does not allow for consent, how do you differentiate between manipulation and romantic pursuit, flirtation, and seduction?
Ooh, that's a great question. Look, I think, I think we may not always kind of delve down into that level of detail. I know that we have discussed the idea of being kind of harassed into things, that kind of sense of just being like asked again and again and again and again and again until you just sort of feel like, ugh, you know, fine, whatever, you know. And we kind of talk about that in terms of, you know, is that good consent? Is that the kind of consent that you actually want to get from somebody? I guess I mean, each facts will be taken, each situation will be taken on its own facts, I guess, by any court. But in terms of any wooing or seduction, it's all about making sure that people actually want to be there. I think something that's quite pervasive as well is that if you spend money on your date and you take them out somewhere nice and blah blah blah, then you sort of some people have felt entitled to get something at the end of that, specifically sex, and that's just not a thing. Obviously, I probably don't even be needing to say that, but we would definitely say that there's no entitlement. There's no entitlement, even if you're married, even if you've been together for a long time. Consent is still required. But yeah, I think young people are very interested in case studies and working out particular problems, and working out the boundaries of situations. So um, yeah, I'd probably have to very much think on my feet for that one, because that's a tricky one. Yeah, but I think it's coercion. Is it coercion or is it seduction? That kind of thing. It's like, yeah.
That was sort of the next question that an audience member asked. Wouldn't that sort of consent be seen as coercion? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might come down to, well, they said yes, and in the but I mean, I guess the whole point of the workshops as well are, how do we avoid being in that situation where it could go either way? Like, we don't want to ever find ourselves in a situation where it's like, ooh, that was a close one. We want to steer really clear of that, and we've given them some really important tools for that too in the workshops. Yeah.
I suppose, Julianne, what you've been saying is the importance of communication. And if you're flirting with someone or pursuing them, if they're communicating that they're receptive to that, then that's one thing. But if they're not, if they're communicating that they're not welcoming your pursuit or flirtation, then it would,
Mm.
you would have to clarify whether there is any consent there.
Yeah. And even if they're wavering, like if they're wavering, then that's also not great. Because, I mean, what we want is, the law is not necessarily enthusiastic consent, but ethically speaking, what we do want is enthusiastic consent. So in that situation, even if there's a waiver, we should be backing off and not pushing forward, for sure.
There's just one other question. Well, I
Yeah.
guess asking for you to comment is about cultural and religious practices which allow some called people to have sex with or without consent, but not under duress.
Okay. Some tricky cultural relative
Mm.
stuff there. Look, I mean, I'm not aware of that, and I've never heard of that, and I do work with an extremely broad cultural base of young people across Sydney and around New South Wales. Um, Having said that, if there's no consent, there's no consent. If a person in that situation wanted to, they could go to the police and get help about that.
Just one question about sexual assault. Is there a difference in prison time for sexual assault between married couples?
No, no, it's I think gone are the days that wives can be hit with a certain width of stick, and rape is impossible in marriage, or sexual assault is impossible in marriage. It's just not. Isn't those are not things that are used today, at least in current law enforcement or in the courts. Um, Sexual assault is sexual assault regardless of marriage status or relationship status. You wouldn't get a lesser sentence just because you were their partner.
There's one question about people with disability who are non-verbal and may not be able to verbally consent. Is there guidance about this?
Yeah, and I mean, people can consent in all different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. Um, I mean, and I'm sure that people with non-verbal disabilities have their own systems of working that out and negotiating with their partners. It could be writing. It could be gestures or movements. Yeah, so it, as long as it's clear to the person. And again, it's the person's responsibility to make sure that it is clear, however that is, however they want to work that. Yeah.
Okay, we might just pause there with the questions and move on.
Cool. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Um, and this is sexual touching crime. And I've done some work with some women in the Bankstown area, actually, in the last couple of years, where they wrote a list of questions based on things that had happened to them and their friends around the place that they weren't happy about, which had to do with consent and sex and so on. So what they were saying is that they'd had a situation where they might be going out to nightclubs, and these were older girls, and that men would try and kiss them without their consent. So that's definitely sexual touching without consent. It's basically anyone deliberately making physical contact with another person in a sexual way without the consent. So the kissing example, if you're on a bus and someone's, pushed up behind you in a really sleazy, gross way, doesn't matter if you're clothed. Um, it's that kind of vibe. Okay, so you've been touched and it's just not correct. Yeah, it's not sex, it's not the whole situation, but it is something that's made you very uncomfortable and you certainly didn't consent. Penalty 5 years, and again we've got the child protection register. Okay. And the last thing that we want to talk about before the quizzes, I think, is sexual act. This is actually your stereotyped guy in the park with a long coat who opens it and got nothing underneath, and they're exposing themselves to people in the park. Um, people openly masturbating on trains. Sorry, I know this is like ew. But these are the kind of things that we mean when we say sexual act. So when somebody does something sexual in front of another person without their consent. We've got an 18-month maximum penalty and possible child protection registration. Oh gosh, no, I forgot there's other things. Okay, next slide. We'll go through this quite quickly. The child protection register is pretty serious. This is what will happen, if you were found guilty of any of the crimes that we saw earlier, you can end up on the register. You're on for life. You report for either 7 years as a child or 10 years as an adult. All of those things on the screen. But also, I think what's a really big deal for this one is that you won't end up being able to pass a working with children check. And so I'm trying to kind of talk to young people a lot about how many different kinds of jobs these days need working with children checks. So, even things like sexting, cyberbullying, stuff that can actually end up on the register as well. So we tend to talk about that a lot because that's one of the longest lasting things, far longer than any jail sentence that a young person would ever get. Okay, sorry, I'm rushing through this a little bit more now. Okay, so age of consent. Obviously, we know that 16 is the age of that you can say yes to sex in New South Wales. Next slide. Some pretty serious penalties involved in having sex with someone who's underage. We're not going to go into that too much detail, but obviously the younger the child is in that situation, the higher the prison sentence would be. Okay, next slide. Something that you may or may not be familiar with already is that a few years ago, New South Wales government passed a law around a defence for similar age sex. This came about because, honestly, one of the most common questions I get asked at schools is, what if there's a 15-year-old and another 15-year-old? I cannot tell you how many times I have been asked that in my career. This kind of has a look at those dynamics where, yes, they're underage, but no, there's not a big power dynamic because it's not a 40-year-old or something. It's another person of a similar age. So it's a defence. It might mean that the police won't charge if the situation was consensual in all other ways, like nobody was forcing anyone to do anything. You have to be at least 14 years old. So 14 and 16 is fine, but 12 and 14 is not fine. 15, 17 is fine. Young people do get a little bit surprised sometimes when I say that once you turn 16, there's kind of no rule against you hooking up with someone a lot older, because they often ask. But I do say, well, just think about what kind of person wants to hook up with someone much, 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 much younger than them, even if they are of legal age. So we have a bit of a chat about that. Okay. And
We've got some more audience questions. Would you like to
yes,
respond to those before we move on to the polls that we're going to run?
sure. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So one question is, how does the law look at consent being given in a situation where the victim feels they're not in a position to say no, but where consent has been asked for and no apparent threat has been made? However, the victim feels they could potentially be in danger if they say no.
Mm.
Sounds a little bit like coercion.
Yeah. Look, I mean, again, sometimes these things would have to go to court, and the veracity, that would all have to be tested. But if somebody is saying yes because they feel they're in danger, if they say no, then that should definitely be a thing that's an issue that's been raised, because that would definitely affect whether or not there was consent. Yeah.
Another question is about the Child Protection Register. Is it state-based or federally managed?
State-based. It's run by the New South Wales Police. They've got a special name. I think it's the Crime Command who do it. But at the same time, that information is readily shared, I'm sure, around other jurisdictions. Yeah.
And this is sort of a hypothetical question, but will the sentence time for sexual assault and aggravated assault ever be raised? And do you think laws will become more strict as time moves on?
I don't know. It often is a very politicized issue, like the sentence times, and whether you think that a long sentence will actually change anything. I mean, everyone gets out eventually, so it's kind of like that. Without getting too political, because here representing Legal Aid, I would say we haven't really been seeing a lot of movement. I mean, if they were going to change the amount of time, they might have done it at the same time as the consent laws. So, yeah, perhaps it won't be for a while. Yeah.
A few people have asked if you're willing to share the slides with the audience, if that's something we can send out to people by email after the webinar.
Yeah, I think that should be okay. Yeah.
And one last question's just come through. Is there jail time for masturbating in public?
Yes. Yes. So that was the sexual act. I mean, if nobody was there, like, I mean, the sexual act is kind of designed to affect other people, you know, like that, because there's consent. So if somebody saw that, it's highly unlikely that they consented to seeing that. So if you were by yourself, that would be a different kind of crime, like offensive conduct or something like that. Um, the, 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 the concept of masturbating in public is really about making people watch something that they didn't want to watch. Yeah. So does that answer your question? Hopefully.
Sorry, a couple more questions have just come through. Is the legal defence for underage consensual relationships legislated or case law?
Legislated. Yeah. So, yeah.
And then another audience member has asked, what would constitute evidence? Perhaps
Of
that's in relation to that discussion of when you're answering the other question about
the
where
masturbation.
I thought perhaps it might be in relation to the discussion of the situation where the victim didn't feel they could say no. They thought they may be in danger.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, this is one of the tricky things about this area. Oftentimes, it's not something where anyone else was there, you know, so there can't be sort of supporting witness statements or anything like that. But it's usually a one-on-one kind of like, yeah, my word, your word, see what's
Sorry,
what.
they've clarified. It's about the sexual act offence. So unwanted exposure. How would you, I guess, give evidence if you wanted to report that?
Well, I mean, if you just gave your statement about what happened, and oftentimes it's on public transport for some reason, and public transport often has CCTV these days, so there might be some footage as well. Um, uh, they might be somebody who's, you know, done it a bit already in other places, so, you know, there might be different kinds of things that the police can use to investigate. Yeah.
Okay, would you like me to launch the polls now?
Yeah, why not? Let's do that. Um, so what we're going to do is we're going to give you a list of statements, and we're going to work out which ones are true and which ones are false. Is that right, Bridget? That's right, isn't it? Oh, you're on mute, Dels.
Sorry, they're in sets of three. That's right. The polls are in sets of, there'll be 3 questions, and we'll get you to click on your screen and choose true or false. And then after each set of 3, Julianne will discuss the answers.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the first poll, everybody. Touching someone in a sexual way without their consent is a crime called sexual touching. So true or false to that? Okay, I'm hoping people have responded. I'll just close that off now and share the results.
Hey, thank you so much. So that is true. So excellent. Um, that's the one that we were talking about before about you know, being you know, kissed without consent, being, you know, grabbed on the butt without consent or something like that. So it has to be sexual. It can't just be someone running into you. But it's something, yeah, that does make you feel uncomfortable in that way, and you definitely haven't agreed to it. Thanks, Bridget.
Okay, the next one.
Oral sex is not penetration under the law. True or false?
Okay, I'll close that off now.
Awesome. Most people got false, which is correct. Sounds funny to say it like that. Absolutely, oral sex is included, whether it's on, oral sex on a vulva or a penis.
Okay. The next one.
If someone is asleep, they cannot consent to sex. True or false?
Okay, I'll close that off now.
Excellent. Most people got true, and that is correct. You can't speak, you can't make your wishes known if you are fast asleep.
Okay, so that's the first three, and now we've got some more polls to run.
Great. A 16-year-old can't consent to sex with someone in a position of care or authority over them, e.g., teacher, sports coach, maths tutor. True or false?
Okay, everyone's answering. I'll just give a little bit more time.
No problem.
Okay, we'll close that off. And here are the results.
Fantastic. Yep. Most people got that right. It is true. You can't consent. It's just the power imbalance, or the position of authority just makes it totally not okay. And that includes for people who are actually at or over the age of consent. So that's just something to watch out for.
Okay, and the next one.
You can't get into trouble for watching and egging on someone to sexually assault someone else because you weren't the one doing it.
So let's see what everybody thinks. Okay, I'll close that off now.
Okay.
And share the results.
That is very heartening, people. Most people got that correct. False, of course, you are going to get into trouble. And again, with that whole ethics versus law thing, hopefully, even if you couldn't get in trouble for it, you would also not do it because it's not a great thing to do.
Okay, then the last one in this set. Just start this next one.
Yeah. A person accused of a criminal offence has the right to be treated as innocent until proven guilty.
Okay. All right, we'll close that one off and share the results.
Thank you, Bridget. Awesome. That is correct. We do have that right, and I guess that's what happens when somebody's accused of something. The police always have to prove the charges against someone beyond reasonable doubt, unless that person pleads guilty at court.
Okay.
Bridget, we can just leave the rest if you want, because we've only got a few more minutes left. I don't know if there's any more questions.
Yes, there is. Hi, regarding called communities and religious beliefs, I'm a Muslim migrant, and unfortunately, many men use some false religious beliefs to force and manipulate their wives to sleep with them, including putting pressure on the women. And the person says they believe this happens in other religious and cultural backgrounds. Sorry, it's not. I've just realised it's not. It's just quite a long. There's a lot of typing, so I've just realised it's not a question. But this audience member would like everyone in any field related to this topic to know that domestic violence in Islam is not accepted, and there is a verse that forbids force in all aspects of life. I encourage my female clients to challenge those beliefs and wanted to make sure that other professionals are aware of that.
Thank you for that.
Will this information and workshop be going into schools?
Yep, I have been running these workshops for the last maybe 3 years in schools, and we're just obviously I have updated it to include the new law changes. We are free. We go to schools and youth services and other services around New South Wales. So if you're interested, please do let us know. We can come and work with your clients / students / whatever. Yeah.
And someone else has asked, do you know the Love Bites program?
I do, yep. I'm not trained in the Love Bites program, but I work with many people who are, and I have helped to deliver it in a youth detention centre before, with the boys there, just kind of giving a bit of support for the legal stuff. So yeah, I mean, obviously this is just one resource out of many. I think we really support each other very well. Love Bites is a really long program, which is amazing, but it can go for like 2 days. So we tend to kind of do the kind of 1 hour short hit, a bit similar to what we've talked about today.
I think that's all the questions so far for now.
Great. All right. Well, it sounds like people are quite interested to get the slides, so I'm very happy to share them afterwards, sort of as a PDF. You've also got the consent fact sheet as a handout, so download that before you go.
That's right.
Yes.
And I can also, when we send a copy of the slides as a PDF, we can also send that handout again in case people aren't able to access it through this. And I'll just move to the last slide because
Oh,
someone
thank you.
has, and someone has also asked, how do we get in touch with you?
I'm happy
And
for. Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, we will send an email, so you'll get the CLE email address. So CLE@legalaid.nsw.gov.au is an email address that you can email to request a workshop or to ask any further questions that occur to you. Any questions that you've typed in or that you want to type in, we can respond to any that we haven't covered after the webinar. So we will send the handout and a PDF of the slides to everybody who's registered for the webinar today.
Great. Yeah, so I thought, just in terms of where to get help, obviously it can be quite a heavy subject. I usually remind the kids about the kids helpline, but for the rest, I really include adults as well. So the 1-800 respect number provides counselling for survivors of sexual assault. Headspace can help in your local area. And just in terms of counselling, Q Life I've included there, and that's a counselling service and web chat for people within the LGBTIQA+ community. And then if you're looking for legal help about any of your problems in this area or others, community legal centres are a really great place to start, as well as Legal Aid. Please remember that if you have kids in trouble with the police, though, they should call us directly on the Legal Aid Youth Hotline, and that number is 1800 10 18 10.
And I've just added one more slide that actually has that email address just so people can see it visually. And there is also the law access number for people wanting as a point of contact for people seeking legal help.
Yeah. Well, right on time, Bridget.
Thank you to our audience. Everybody's saying thank you very much and what a great presentation. So
good.
thank you, Julianne. It's obviously very current and useful information, and we hope that people that have joined us today can share it with their clients that they're working with.
Yep, for sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your questions and your participation. Appreciate it.
Okay, we'll end the webinar now. Thanks, everybody.